Procrastination, going along with this, and in a sense you see that a little bit in that quote that I just gave you. But another of my students wrote this about his problems writing papers. He said, "I place pressure on myself to perfectly perform. If I cannot meet this standard, then the effort, no matter how detailed and diligent, and the end result, no matter how excellent, are worthless. In the past, I found great enjoyment in composing an academic paper. However, in recent years, the pressure I place on myself to perform has stripped away any enjoyment I once received from writing. Simple papers routinely take me at least 3 times longer to complete than the average student. I scrupulously examine each word, sentence, and paragraph. In my mind, as I write, every paper must be worthy of publishing, each thesis worthy of a Pulitzer Prize." And you can understand why he never wants to write. He never wants to put down on paper the final version in case it will be criticized. So he keeps off and putting off writing. I've had to work with students to help them to do drafts, to go and talk to the professor, to confess that they have this problem, and set deadlines for drafts so that they don't leave it all until the very last minute. Now, procrastination, I think, comes from both a combination of perfectionism and laziness. It can be either or both. Decreased productivity and performance. This research done on athletes, on salesmen, has shown that the ones who are the highly perfectionist individuals tend to sell less encyclopedias or whatever they're selling, tend to have a much harder time recovering from a door closed in their face and a refusal, or an athlete who fails at the high jump or long jump or something, makes a mistake. The perfectionists have a much harder time recovering. They think, if I can't do it well enough, then why bother? Why go on? Why even continue? So it's the difficulty recovering from mistakes there. Now, the ones who were the more healthy perfectionists, sort of 75% perfectionists rather than 90%, actually sold a lot and or performed much better in their athletic competitions. Impaired health. You can understand if you're this stressed, you're likely to have the psychosomatic disorders of headaches, blood pressure, heart problems, and so on that often go along with increased stress. And then, of course, eating disorders. And this relates very much to the images in the culture for young women particularly, and increasingly young men, as they are faced with similar images. But as you know, most of the Hollywood women and the Miss America women are, in the 5% bracket of the population who are that thin, that slim. A lot of the advertisements, for instance, this is from a teen fashion magazine, but most of the young women are shown as incredibly slim. Sometimes unhealthily so, to the point of emaciation. And of course, anorexia nervosa can be a fatal illness. 10 to 15% of people who develop anorexia will die with this disease. It develops a life of its own where someone becomes delusional about their view of themselves. They think of themselves as much larger than they really are. Now, many young women hover on the edge of this during their teen years and thankfully come out of it again. But young men too, the Abercrombie and Fitch models, are more and more being pushed into the direction of having the perfect body. And for some young men get into the anorexic cycle, some go into the opposite extreme of this sort of living with the culture of Baywatch or of Abercrombie and Fitch, spending hours obsessing in the gym over developing muscles and looking like this guy, or they begin to take, and many young men are using these sorts of chemicals. They're easily available on the internet. And they have all sorts of physiological problems, of course, if you use them over a long period of time. I like this image of this guy just turning his back on that culture. He seems to have the right attitude to it all here. So eating disorders, and it may be people who go to one extreme or the other. Of course, there's the obsession with being incredibly thin, incredibly good-looking, or very buff and muscular. Or there is the opposite extreme of feeling utterly defeated by this, so you don't care anymore. This is the black and white, all or nothing thinking. So you don't care if you put on weight, if you look scruffy and unkempt, don't care for yourself. The extremes of attention or too little attention to the God's gift of your body. So eating disorders, depression I've mentioned already. Again, obviously with people who are down on themselves, self-critical, this is going to be more of a problem. And associated with the suicidal ideas like Vince Foster. Another public figure that I think of is Admiral Border. Some of you may remember him. He rose up through the ranks, was greatly loved apparently by the man that he had command over. And for some reason, people don't fully understand it, I think he had quite a strong perfectionist streak in him and had a pretty low view of himself. And there came a time when, I think on a public parade, he wore medals that he hadn't earned, a medal for valor that he hadn't actually earned. Now, strange that he would do that. Somehow he was trying to boost his own image to the world, but when it was noticed, and when he was just before a press conference where this would be exposed publicly, he went out and took his own life, like Vince Foster. I think another individual who failure, he just couldn't deal with failure. And his all or nothing thinking took him into this suicidal depression, feeling he'd let not only himself down, but let everyone else down as well. And we've talked a bit about relationship problems. You saw in that video clip from Desperate Housewives, the sort of extreme of the person who is so rigid, so perfectionist, that they cannot really relate deeply to anyone because control is so important. Or either they are very critical of themselves, or they may be very critical of another person who never lives up to their standards. The person who's very critical of themselves is always afraid to be intimate, afraid that they will be exposed, afraid that if they show their real emotions, their real heart, then the other person will reject them, and there'll be a failure. And then finally here in the perils, the relationship to obsessive-compulsive symptoms. Now we talk in the psychiatric world, the psychotherapeutic world, of obsessive-compulsive personality and obsessive-compulsive disorder. You know, in this movie you see a man, Howard Hughes, who had obsessive-compulsive disorder. I think he was also an obsessive-compulsive personality and a sort of a driving man, obsessed with certain things. But he became, in his later, obsessed with cleanliness, obsessed with the fear that germs would one day get him and kill him. So he develops this elaborate, incredible lifestyle of cutting himself off from any risk, whether of washing, not allowing people into his room. People who came to cut his hair had to be dressed like surgeons in gowns and masks and sterile, scrubbed hands and all that sort of thing. But the obsessive-compulsive personality often is just the person who is an extreme perfectionist, likes order, makes lists, keeps everything very structured and controlled in their life, and finds it very hard to live with change, to deal with change. Now, obsessive-compulsive disorder sometimes occurs where there is a previously obsessive personality. Sometimes it can occur in anyone, someone under stress for some reason, or it may occur in young children. Children can develop obsessive-compulsive symptoms. It's not uncommon in children around the age of between 5 and 10 somewhere to have for a period of time an obsession with some fear or phobia. They usually grow out of it. But for some people it continues, and it can be an extreme thing, whether it's having to turn off the switch 50 times before you leave a room, counting backwards, while you wash your hands, saying certain words, developing rituals like that protect you from infection or protect you from something. The fear is something disastrous will happen if I don't do this thing just right. It's a terrible place to live, caught by obsessive compulsive disorder. And it seems to me that there's a large biological, organic component to this, because the antidepressant medication, and some of them are better at this than others, is very helpful for many people with obsessive compulsive disorder. So there is help for that, as well as cognitive psychotherapy can help, and some behavioral therapy. That's much more in the realm of illness than the perfectionist obsessive compulsive personality, which is more just a personality trait. How are we doing on time here? I think I'd like to keep going for a few minutes here on talking about the roots of perfectionism. I mentioned last night that I think there is a genetic factor. For some people, I think of one child who has two very perfectionist parents, and they brought this child to me when she was about 6, and she was having temper tantrums when she put on her socks in the morning. If the sock was slightly misaligned, if the seam didn't run exactly straight, she would just have a screaming tantrum. She needed to have everything ordered around her. Now, it's hard to know whether this was what she'd learned from her parents or whether this was something she had inherited. But as I've talked to a number of parents, I did a little informal research amongst the seminary students about the ones who had children. And they gave me stories of children who were obsessed with this type of food they ate, not getting their hands messy, not being able to touch food, whereas most children love putting their hands through food, wanting everything neat, ordered, toys in a certain place before they could go to sleep. Now, some children grew out of this. For some, this went on into a more perfectionist lifestyle. So I think there is a genetic component to this. The culture we've really looked at, the Hollywood culture, the fashion culture, the sports world, the seductive sirens, as I've called them, of perfectionism. But then the family, I think the example of our parents is incredibly powerful here. The modeling of parents. One student wrote this. He said, "My father still works about 70 hours a week, certainly not because he needs to. When he was home, it was not pleasant. He expected only the best. We had to make straight A's. We had to be the most behaved, well-mannered children. We had to be the best tennis players, even though he never watched any of us play because he was at work. We had to have the best yard. I remember that we had to mow the grass in our yard in a pattern like the grass tennis courts at Wimbledon. It had to look perfect. As expected, I, like my brothers, failed often to live up to his expectations. The result was discipline, as well as criticism for not achieving only the best. Dad was a very hard disciplinarian. However, while he did not spare the rod, he was not physically abusive. Love was seldom expressed growing up, either verbally or by body language." So here is a combination, I think, of a parent who gives an example by his workaholic obsession with perfection, everything being just right, but also he is shaming his children into being that way too. They have to. He's ordering the oughts and the shoulds of the socially prescribed perfectionist are being implanted deeply in his children's hearts and minds. Another example, this lady said to me, "My mother, as a middle child of 14 children raised during the Depression, grew up in insecurity, uncertainty, and crowded chaos. She seems to have sought security by controlling and ordering all things. I watched my mother compulsively clean our home, trying to undo the disorder that followed in the wake of her 5 active children. She actually stripped and waxed all the wooden floors weekly. Today she can make me feel guilty and angry when she reprimands me for not cleaning the inside of my refrigerator weekly. It is obvious both my parents modeled a perfectionist work ethic. To this day I find it difficult to relax until all tasks and chores are finished. And she had a father who was a perfectionist too. He did all the sort of home remodeling, but he would take forever to do it. He'd take 5 years to do the kitchen because it had to be absolutely perfect. But when he did, it was beautiful. So there is this, the example, the modeling of parents. And then the psychodynamic view. This obviously coming from Freud. Now Freud's obsession with the anal stage of development. You remember he talks about the oral, the anal, and the phallic stages of development. And he saw people who are obsessive perfectionists, people who are stuck at the anal stage of development. They want control. They don't want to give up control to their parents, whether it's potty training or whatever else it is. And some of the images of this sort of the stingy person who wants to keep control and collect everything, the miserly attitude of hoarding, come down from, in our language, we talk about people who are stinking rich, who are making a pile. This is the anal stage of development we're talking about. But I think Freud is sort of right, because it is at that age of life when children are just leaving their parents where the insecurities become very pronounced. And their desire to control insecurity, to make everything just right, if at that time of life their parents are quarreling a lot, where there isn't security in the home, that's a very deep, early stage of life where the insecurities may go on into later life if you never work through that stage properly. And so the desire to be in control may arise from very early insecurities. And of course, I think perhaps the most powerful internal driver of perfectionism is shame and abuse. One young woman, I can find the place here. Actually, I have it here. Actually, this is not a young woman. This is about John Porgetti Jr. He grew up with his mother and his brother. His father had left home. He seldom saw his father. And he recalls that once when he was in high school, he wrote Paul Sr. a letter that was returned with all the grammar and the spelling errors corrected, but with no personal comment. I never got over that, he says now. I wanted to be judged as a human being, and I could never get that from him. And it is this criticism of any mistake. The parent who, when a child at the breakfast table knocks over a glass of orange juice or milk, and the parent yells, "You stupid idiot, you're always so clumsy." This assassination of character, rather than compassion with a child's failings. This wasn't a deliberate mistake. This was a flaw that anyone can have in life, to knock over something. But that sort of repetitive being shamed as a child for making mistakes. One young woman told me her mother always used to attack her for her being too fat, being inconsiderate, never cleaning up after herself. And she said, I sought desperately to please my mother. I became perfect at everything I did. I got straight A's in school. And eventually she became obsessive about her weight to the point of developing anorexia nervosa. A young man, and this relates much more to abuse, told me a terrible story about he was in his 40s when he came to talk to me at the seminary. He was a final year student there. He'd been in business, a very effective businessman, very high standards, striving for excellence. When his children reached the age of 6 and 8, he said he began to have tremendous rage in his soul. And he couldn't understand quite why he was so angry, but he felt he wouldn't be able to control it. He came to talk and he told me this horrific story about how his mother and his grandmother, who he described as the most evil woman on the planet, used to wait at home for him. His father was a long-distance truck driver, was never at home. Waited home, and they would devise the most horrendous tortures for him, the worst of which was to hold him underwater in the bathtub until he never knew whether he was going to survive. And they would beat him, all sorts of things to him. And he always believed that it was his fault. He thought, if I can be a better boy, and he'd go off to school in long sleeves, long pants to hide the bruises, and he would get straight A's, and he would be best in the athletics team, but he never got their approval. He always just got more torture. And the reason it had happened, this was when he was about 8, this was happening to him. And now what was beginning to surface was his rage that he was feeling when his children at the age of 6 and 8 were not performing the way he wanted them to. But he had become, I think, in many ways, a perfectionist out of this awful abuse in his earlier years. And it might happen with sexual abuse in the same sort of way. Another young man told me that when his parents were arguing all the time and threatening a divorce, he was so insecure, so terrified that they would separate, and that he would go into his room and he would arrange all his socks in a neat row in the drawer. His desk, he'd arrange all the pens in a neat row. He said, if there's chaos, disorder out there in the world, I'm going to make order here in my room, the one sanctuary where he felt things were in control. In school, obviously, peers can be very cruel. Annie Lamott writes, describing her childhood experience, she says, all I ever wanted was to belong, to wear that hat of belonging. In 7th and 8th grades, I still weighed about 40 pounds. I was 12 years old and had been getting teased about my strange looks for most of my life. This is difficult in the United States of advertising, as Paul Krasner puts it. And if you are too skinny, or too tall, or dark, or weird, or short, or frizzy, or homely, or poor, or nearsighted, you get crucified. I did. And you know how the pressure to conform to the peers, and we've seen some of the pressure to conform to the images in advertising that are so powerful. And then finally, I think in the church, we can create an environment in the church of legalism, an obsession with appearance and performance that is really driving a sort of Christian, really unhealthy Christian perfectionism. Now, I'm not against beauty in architecture and in worship and a sense of reverence and respect in coming into the Lord's presence in worship. But think for a moment of what it does to someone who's, say, struggling with pornography addiction or alcoholism, or his wife is leaving him, or his child is on drugs, and he comes into church for the first time and sees a church, as I often go into, a church of impeccably dressed people as if they're going to a wedding, and there is just green and gold and white and everything is perfect. There's not a blemish or a flaw in the church building. And everything goes according to plan. It's all ordered, structured. This person will feel, this place, I don't belong in this place. I don't fit here. These people have got it all together, and I haven't. And therefore will be driven out of the very place where he should be experiencing grace and acceptance. So somehow in our churches we have to create an environment, I think, of acceptance of flaws, of imperfections. We'll come back to that in a moment. So I'm saying that the sort of psychological roots, I think, underlying much unhealthy perfectionism are shame, the fear of failure, of rejection, of loss of control, often rooted in self-protection in the early years of life, which is in a way legitimate, but later in life those patterns of fear of failure, of rejection, the desire to be in control, often become sinful patterns of self-protection and unhealthy ones. And then of course there is pride. This is the sort of the flip side of self-contempt. And I think in all of our hearts there is a sense of low self-esteem, of self-contempt, self-hatred, things that we don't like about ourselves. But there's also the other side, the flip side of that, is the desire to be perfect in our own strength, that we should be able to reach that standard. And the desire to be better than everyone else. I want to be top dog, I want to be perfect, I want to be a straight A student, because I want to be better than everyone else. So there is a real sense of I think, of pride at the root of much perfectionism. And then here we get a little more philosophical and going out from the psychological into our beliefs about the nature of reality. Because if you think of the worldviews in our culture, distilling it down to three very simple ones, if you believe that we have come to this point in our existence through a process of evolution from the primal ooze combined with chance and time, and you may believe that somehow evolution is going to make us all better as a species, is going to perfect us, whatever perfection is, that's one view of reality. And how much part you have in that to make it better varies with who you talk to. Some people say we can take evolution into our own hands and make ourselves better. Another major worldview, which is much more the view of Eastern philosophy, of Hinduism, of Buddhism, and much New Age thinking, is a belief in an impersonal God or an energy force, and we are all part of that. We are one with the universe, one with God, which really means, if you take this to its logical conclusion, what many of the higher Vedanta philosophers would say, you are perfect already, just the way you are. You don't have to perfect yourself. What you need to do is get into a meditative discipline where you realize, come to a change of awareness of state, which is you're perfect the way you are. Don't try harder, just be the way you are. Or they might put it, you are becoming God if you are not God already. But many of them would say, you are God, just appropriate that perfection. And your problem is that you think you're not. So all you need to do is change your awareness. And then, of course, the third major worldview is the Judeo-Christian view of a personal God who has created us perfect, and that we have fallen from that, and that we are being restored because of Christ's redemption, and that one day we will be perfect again. And in that understanding of what is going on in our psyche, there is an understandable longing, aspiration for perfection. Because it comes both from a memory that is still there in us of that perfection that we once had in the Garden of Eden before the fall, and an awareness and an aspiration that God has built eternity into our hearts, that there is something more coming, a perfection that is coming that God has promised to those who believe in Him. So it is both a memory and a longing that drives us, I think, towards perfection. So this is, besides the psychological and the sociological, here is, in a sense, a deep, as it were, theological internal drive towards perfection. Now maybe, I think probably this would be a good time to take a brief break and collect questions. Is that right, Glenn? Is that what we're going to do?